February 1945. A chaotic, blood-soaked field hospital operates near the freezing Siegfried Line. Inside the crowded canvas medical tents, wounded American soldiers lay on wooden cots, while doctors work under dim hanging lights. The smell of ether, sweat, and copper fills the frigid air as artillery rumbles in the far distance. A sudden commotion shatters the rhythmic groans of the wounded men. Orderlies wheels a new stretcher into the freezing hallway, but the chief surgeon stops them dead in their tracks. With a loud, furious declaration, he flatly refuses to treat the patient, ordering the men to push the bleeding body out into the deep snow to die. General George S. Patton will soon discover this breakdown of order. He will answer this refusal with a terrifying, absolute choice that forces a doctor to remember his oath at the point of a gun. This is the story of what happened when a military doctor refused to save an enemy life, and the general who forced him to choose between a scalpel and a rope. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Lieutenant Mary Molly Sullivan was 26 years old. She came from a tight-knit Irish neighborhood in South Boston. She served with the 77th Evacuation Hospital. Back home, her father and two older brothers worked the active shipyards, teaching her early on that hard labor required steady nerves. She had volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps immediately after the disaster at Pearl Harbor, wanting to protect the young men sent across the sea. Over the past year, she had seen the worst mutilations the European theater could offer. She had patched torn flesh in North Africa, watched boys die of infection in Sicily, and scrubbed dried blood from her fingernails in rain-soaked tents across France. Now, her heavy olive-drab uniform was completely soaked through with the warm blood of an enemy combatant. She had been kneeling on a muddy canvas stretcher for over 60 minutes, pressing her bare thumbs firmly against a torn artery to keep a dying boy alive. Major Thomas Tom Arris was 45 years old. He served as the chief surgeon of the field hospital, having left a lucrative, exclusive private practice in Philadelphia to join the war effort. He considered his exceptional medical skills far too valuable to be spent on anything less than the preservation of American lives. He kept his station organized with meticulous, unyielding precision. Even in the middle of a chaotic winter offensive, his white canvas apron remained pristine, and his polished leather boots never gathered the thick mud of the hallway. He viewed the vast theater of war through a strict lens of personal superiority, believing that his advanced training elevated him above ordinary soldiers. To him, the wounded enemy boy was not a patient, but an obstacle taking up valuable space. He stood near the warmth of the operating stove, slowly washing his hands in a basin of clean, steaming water, completely unbothered by the desperate cries coming from the hallway. The fighting along the Siegfried Line during the final weeks of winter had reduced the landscape to a shattered wasteland of concrete pillboxes and splintered pine trees. Allied forces pressed hard against the western border of Germany, facing a desperate dug-in enemy that used every mine, mortar, and sniper rifle at its disposal to slow the relentless advance. Casualties on both sides climbed rapidly, as the bitter cold proved just as lethal as the incoming artillery shells. Field hospitals stayed pushed to their absolute limits, operating constantly under a deluge of broken bodies that overwhelmed the available staff, blankets, and surgical instruments. In this environment of pure exhaustion, small human compromises routinely went unnoticed by higher command. Divisions routinely ignored minor infractions, and many frontline officers looked the other way when medical personnel made difficult choices regarding who received immediate treatment and who was forced to wait. The sheer volume of wounded American soldiers meant that captured enemy combatants were regularly shunted to the bottom of the priority list, often left to languish for hours in dark corners without receiving basic triage. It was an unspoken reality of the late winter campaign, born from a desperate scarcity of plasma and clean bandages. Most senior commanders remained entirely focused on the tactical maps, leaving the internal administration of the medical tents to the discretion of the chief surgeons. They assumed the doctors worked with uniform professionalism, unaware of the bitter prejudices festering just beneath the surface of the medical corps. That institutional neglect created a vacuum where a powerful doctor could easily transform his personal hatred into a death sentence for a captive. The orderlies continued their grim work in the hallway, moving the heavy wooden litters while the young German boy continued to slip closer toward total silence. Lieutenant Sullivan held her position on the muddy floor, her hands trembling from the strain as she looked up at the chief surgeon. "Major, this boy is going to bleed out right here if we do not get him onto a table immediately," she said. Major Eris did not look back at her, continuing to dry his fingers with a small, clean towel. "Then let him bleed," he said. "We have an empty table in the secondary tent right now, and the shrapnel can be removed in 20 minutes, she said. "My instruments are reserved for men who fight for civilization, not the fascist garbage trying to tear it down," he said. "He is 16 years old, Major, and he is completely unarmed," she said. "He wore the uniform of the enemy, and that makes him an enemy," he said. "The regulations state we must treat every casualty based on medical priority alone," she said. "Do not lecture me on regulations, Lieutenant, because I am the commanding medical authority in this sector," he said. "He is crying for his mother, sir, and he is just a child," she said. "He should have thought about that before his army started killing our boys in the woods," he said. Sullivan tightened her grip on the boy's wound, her voice rising above the low rumble of the distant artillery. "If you throw him outside into the snow, you are murdering him," she said. "I am allocating limited American plasma to American soldiers who actually deserve to live," he said. "The Geneva Convention strictly protects wounded prisoners of war from being abandoned to die," she said. "The Geneva Convention does not operate inside my surgical tent during an active winter offensive," he said. "You took an oath to save lives regardless of the uniform, Major," she said. "My oath applies to human beings, Lieutenant, not to the rabble that started this war," he said. "Then you are flatly refusing to perform your duties as a medical officer," she said. "I am ordering the orderlies to clear this hallway and move that stretcher out into the cold," he said. Sullivan looked at the orderlies, who stood frozen in the doorway, terrified to move. "Do not touch this litter," she said. "Get away from that stretcher, Lieutenant, or I will have you removed for insubordination," he said. "I will not let this boy die in the snow while an empty table is right there," she said. "Then you can join him outside because your shift in this hospital is officially over," he said. The senior medical administrator walked into the hallway, took one look at the bleeding boy, and immediately turned toward the exit. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. Every man in the freezing hallway stiffened instantly. The crying of the young German soldier suddenly seemed to echo louder against the canvas walls. Patton walked straight into the operating tent, his boots clicking firmly against the floorboards. He studied the clean surgeon washing his hands at the basin. Patton asked him what was happening in the hallway. Eris answered that a mortally wounded German combatant was blocking the medical transit line. Patton asked why the boy had not been moved to an operating table. Eris answered that American plasma was far too valuable to waste on a dying Nazi. Patton asked if the hospital still operated under the rules of the United States Army. Eris answered that his medical judgment took priority over ordinary logistics during a major winter advance. Patton studied him. "You have a false view of your station, Major," Patton said. "You believe those white sleeves elevate you above the articles of war. They do not. The uniform that boy wears makes him a prisoner under my custody, and my custody guarantees him the protections of the Geneva Convention. You think you are a deity who gets to select who lives and dies in this theater. You are an officer of the United States Medical Corps, and your duties are absolute. Look at that nurse, Major. Her uniform is covered in the blood of an enemy because she understands discipline and basic human decency. She has done your job for an hour while you kept your hands warm by the stove. You tell me that plasma is scarce, but I see clean water, fresh bandages, and an empty table right behind you. Your arrogance is a stain on this entire division, and it ends right now. You have a choice. Scrub back in, take the scalpel, and save that boy's life. or face an immediate court-martial for abandoning your oath and violating military law. If you choose the court-martial, I will strip you of your rank before the sun goes down. If that boy dies because you refuse to try, I will personally see you hanged from the nearest pine tree. Decide now." Eris turned pale, his hands trembling as he reached back into the wash basin. Major Eris scrubbed back in with frantic, trembling movements. The pristine white apron he had kept clean all morning was quickly splattered with water and antiseptic as he rushed to the empty table in the secondary tent. Orderlies quickly wheeled the canvas stretcher inside, the metal wheels squeaking loudly against the floorboards. Patton stood directly behind the surgeon, his shadowed figure looming over the entire procedure. His eyes locked on every cut and movement of the blade. The cold air from the hallway leaked under the tent flap, but sweat poured down the doctor's face as he worked under the dim, swinging electric lamp. The medical staff watched in absolute silence as Eris removed 3 jagged pieces of iron shrapnel from the boy's thigh. He worked with a desperate speed he had never shown in his private practice. His hands shaking each time, Patton's boots shifted on the wood behind him. Lieutenant Sullivan stood opposite the surgeon, passing the clamps and sutures with steady, practiced movements while checking the boy's weak pulse. When the final artery was tied and the wound was closed, the young German soldier's breathing finally stabilized, his shallow gasps turning into a rhythmic, quiet sleep. Eris dropped his bloodied instruments into the metal tray with a loud clang, staring at his stained hands while the surrounding staff slowly let out their collective breath. Lieutenant Mary Molly Sullivan returned home to South Boston in the late autumn of 1945. She married a mechanic from her old neighborhood, raised 4 children, and spent 3 decades working as a head surgical nurse at a city charity hospital. She never boasted about her wartime service, but she kept a small, dented metal army tray on her dresser until her death in 1994. Major Thomas "Tom" Eris remained with the field hospital until the end of hostilities, though his reputation among the staff never recovered. He returned to his exclusive Philadelphia practice in 1946, but his colleagues noticed a permanent change in his demeanor as he became quiet, meticulous, and entirely unyielding regarding medical protocol. He lived a secluded life in his suburban home, refusing to join any veterans associations or participate in any wartime reunions before passing away quietly in 1978. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident in his official public briefings, but he recounted the details in a private letter to his wife, written several days after the inspection. He noted that a surgeon who forgets his basic oath is far more dangerous than an enemy division because he destroys the underlying discipline of the army from within. He wrote that a true soldier fights the armed enemy with total violence, but protects the helpless without hesitation. Some historians have argued that Patton's extreme intervention in the field hospital was an unnecessary breach of the medical chain of command that disrupted the vital focus of a highly skilled surgeon during a major military campaign. They contend that a field army commander had no place micromanaging medical triage decisions or threatening a decorated officer over a single captive enemy combatant when hundreds of American lives hung in the balance. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that Patton's swift and unyielding enforcement of the rules of war preserved the moral integrity of the United States military at a crucial historical juncture. What is certain is that the medical records of the 77th Evacuation Hospital show the young German soldier survived the night, remaining a durable testament to the moment military authority strictly enforced the basic boundaries of human decency on the battlefield. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the medical decisions entirely to the discretion of the chief surgeon? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.